June 15, 1972, 11:42 a.m., National Archives and Records Administration, College Park, Maryland. In the sterile silence of Reading Room 3, broken only by the low hum of fluorescent lights, a secret that had slept for 27 years began to stir. Dr. Evelyn Reed, a military historian with a reputation for relentless digging, carefully lifted the brittle cardboard lid. The box, labeled *Naro Record Group 227 OSRD, Entry 88, smelled of dust and decaying acid-free paper. Her hands, steady despite the tremor of anticipation, reached inside for the file codenamed ProjectXRay, a document she felt held the key to an untold story of the Pacific War. 1/70th. The story really began on April 1, 1945, on the blood-soaked shores of Okinawa. Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr., commander of the U.S. 10th Army, watched his force of over 183,000 men grind to a halt against a ghost. Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima's 32nd Army wasn't fighting on the island. They were fighting in Sachet. Their defense in-depth network, the Shuri Line, was a subterranean fortress of interlocking caves and concrete pillboxes that rendered conventional artillery useless. U.S. Marines were forced into horrific blowtorch and corkscrew assaults, clearing one bunker at a time, and the cost was staggering. Over 7,000 American casualties in the first 30 days. The air hung thick with the stench of cordite and death, and General Buckner was desperate for a weapon that didn't just explode, but could flow like water and burn like hell itself. 2/70. Thousands of miles away, in the quiet halls of Harvard University, a man who wouldn't know a battlefield from a blackboard held the answer. Dr. Louis Frederick Fieser, the Sheldon Emery Professor of Organic Chemistry, was a man of cold, analytical genius. With a Ph.D. from 1924, his world was one of molecular bonds and chemical reactions, not military strategy. Recruited in 1941 by the National Defense Research Committee, he was given a deceptively simple problem by Group 5 inches, make gasoline sticky. He didn't see soldiers or fortifications. He saw an elegant chemical puzzle waiting to be solved in the confines of his lab. 3/70. That lab, designated X2 and hidden in the basement of the Converse Memorial Laboratory, was a secret within a secret. It was the domain of Colonel M.R. Pickett, U.S. Army Chemical Warfare Service, the project's military director and a West Point graduate from the class of '22. Pickett, a stern man with a master's in chemical engineering from MIT, was the hard-nosed link between Fieser's academic world and the Pentagon's urgent demands. He enforced the project's security classification, Top Secret Bigot, a level so high that fewer than 50 named individuals were cleared to know its full scope. All documents were codenamed ProjectXRay. The lab itself was a concrete bunker, retrofitted, with a dedicated ventilation system and a single steel door, behind which Fieser's team worked under immense pressure, surrounded by the constant, acrid smell of chemical compounds that weren't supposed to exist. 4/70. The breakthrough came on a sweltering Independence Day, July 4, 1942. Inside Lab X2, Dr. Fieser and his team finally perfected the powdered thickening agent, a co-precipitated aluminum soap of *Lun-C-N-Baz-Kne Nod pH-thenic acid and *Palm ITIC acid. They had created a stable gelatinous incendiary from gasoline, a substance they codenamed *Napalm. This viscous jelly, designated Napalm Type C, was 92 to 96% gasoline and could burn at over 200 degrees Fahrenheit for 10 agonizing minutes. It was a chemical monster, a fire that stuck to walls, defied gravity, and consumed all oxygen. It was the weapon that would change everything, and nobody outside that room even knew it had been born. Before I tell you how Dr. Louis Fieser and his secret team turned a Harvard chemistry lab into the arsenal that would break the deadliest battle of the Pacific, comment where you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel. Believe me, you won't want to miss the full story of Project X-Ray. 5/70. The war in the Pacific, by late 1944, had become a brutal, island-by-island slog. The strategy of Admiral Chester Nimitz and General Douglas MacArthur was working, but at a horrifying cost. The battle for Peleliu, which began on September 15, 1944, cost the 1st Marine Division over 500 casualties to take an island just 6 miles long. Conventional weapons, like the 75mm howitzer on the M4 Sherman tank, were proving shockingly ineffective against an enemy that had chosen to fight from inside the Earth itself. The air, thick with the smell of coral dust and diesel fumes, was a constant reminder of a war of attrition. 6/70. This new Japanese doctrine, perfected by Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi on Iwo Jima, was a tactical nightmare. Instead of suicidal banzai charges, his 21,000 men vanished into a honeycomb of over 1,500 caves and 16 miles of interlocking tunnels, protected by reinforced concrete bunkers with walls up to 5 feet thick. From these hidden positions, Type 92 heavy machine guns and Type 96,150mm howitzers would unleash hell upon the advancing U.S. Marines of the 5th Marine Division. For soldiers under the command of Major General Keller E. Rocky, the most terrifying thing wasn't the sound of bullets, but the silence that followed, the knowledge that the enemy was watching from unseen holes in the rock, waiting. This defensive strategy, first seen in September 1944 on Peleliu, was designed to bleed America into a negotiated peace. 7/70. Major George C. Axtell, commanding officer of Marine Fighting Squadron 323, the Death Rattlers, was the man tasked with breaking these positions from the air. At 24 years old, the 1940 Berkeley engineering graduate was lean and intense, with a nervous habit of chewing on an unlit cigar stub. His machine was the Vought F4U4 Corsair, a beautiful brute with a 100-horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine that roared like a demon. Flying from the deck of the U.S. Intrepid CV-11 in early 1945, his missions over islands like Formosa were a blur of engine noise, the acrid smell of high-octane avgas, and the gut-wrenching G-forces of a dive bomb run. He and his wingman, Lieutenant Hank Miller, carried the Standard Ordnance, 2 500-pound general-purpose bombs, and 8 5-inch HVAR rockets. They were powerful, but against Kuribayashi's bunkers, they felt like throwing rocks at a mountain, a frustrating and often futile exercise that cost American lives on the ground with every failed sortie. 8/70. The frustration of men like Axtell echoed all the way back to the Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland, onto the desk of Colonel M.R. Pickett of the U.S. Army Chemical Warfare Service. A stern by-the-book West Point graduate from the class of '22, Pickett was the military taskmaster for Project X-Ray. His office smelled of stale coffee and bureaucratic urgency, having been assigned in 1943 by General Brayon B. Somerville of the Army Service Forces. Pickett's singular mission was to weaponize the strange science coming out of Harvard, a task he pursued with relentless, single-minded focus. 9/70. The problem was that all existing incendiaries were failing. The standard M47 bomb, a 100-pound canister filled with a crude oil and rubber mixture, was a disappointment. It burned out in less than 2 minutes, and its payload would splash harmlessly off the vertical surfaces of concrete bunkers. In a blunt memorandum dated October 12, 1941, Dr. Vannevar Bush, head of the Office of Scientific Research and Development, tasked his teams with creating something entirely new: a cheap, stable, and uniquely adherent fire agent. This was the challenge that landed in the quiet, sterile world of Dr. Louis Fieser's X2 lab at Harvard, a world filled with the gentle clinking of beakers and the low hum of fume hoods, a stark contrast to the chaos it was meant to influence. 10/70. Dr. Louis Frederick Fieser himself was an enigma. Tall, thin, with wire-rimmed glasses perpetually perched on his nose and a slightly stained lab coat covering his tweed jacket, he was the Sheldon Emery Professor of Organic Chemistry. He wasn't driven by patriotic fervor. He was driven by the intellectual puzzle laid out in Government Contract OEMSR 175. With a Ph.D. from Harvard in 1924 and postdoctoral work under Nobel laureate James B. Conant, his entire life was the pursuit of elegant chemical solutions. He had a habit of tapping a fountain pen against his teeth while lost in thought, seeing the military's request not as a weapon to kill, but as a complex molecular problem that had, until then, stumped the best minds at the CWS for over 2 years. The weight he felt wasn't for the lives it might take, but for the scientific reputation of his laboratory and his university. 11/70ths. Then came February 19, 1945, the invasion of Iwo Jima. Lieutenant General Holland M. Howland Mad Smith watched as over 70,000 men of the 5th Amphibious Corps stormed the black volcanic sand. Despite a massive 3-day naval bombardment from Admiral Mark Mitcher's Task Force 58, the defenses built by General Kuribayashi were largely intact. His 21,000 defenders were so deep inside Mount Suribachi that the shelling had been little more than an inconvenience. The air immediately filled with the deafening roar of naval guns and the screams of dying men. 12/70ths. The tactical failure at Iwo Jima was absolute and immediate. The Marines, portable M2 flamethrowers, had a range of just 20 yards, useless against recessed pillboxes. The flame-throwing Sherman Zippo tanks were prime targets for Japanese 47mm anti-tank guns. Frantic reports from commanders on the ground, like Colonel Harry B. Harry the Horse Liversedge of the 28th Marine Regiment, streamed back to CINCPAC headquarters. They all told the same story. Bunkers they had pounded for hours with artillery would suddenly spring back to life. These after-action reports, specifically CINCPACAARIWO-45-3, landed on Colonel Pickett's desk in Washington by mid-March 1945, each page a testament to the urgent need for Fieser's weapon. 13/70ths. That urgency materialized in person on March 22, 1945. Colonel Pickett, his uniform immaculate, flew from Washington to Cambridge, carrying a locked briefcase containing the latest casualty figures from Iwo Jima, over 600-800 American dead. He didn't raise his voice. He calmly met with Dr. Fieser in the X2 lab, laying out battlefield maps from Major General Clifton B. Cates of the 4th Marine Division. He explained in cold, technical terms the need for a weapon that could flow through a 6-inch observation slit and burn long enough to consume every last molecule of oxygen in a sealed space. The napalm Type C gel was ready, but Pickett needed Fieser's final assurance that its chemical structure could withstand the 9G pullout of a Corsair diving at 250 knots and the sub-zero temperatures at 15,000 feet. The quiet sanctuary of academic research was officially over. 14/70ths. The next and final target was Okinawa. Codenamed Operation Iceberg and set for April 1, 1945, it was to be the largest amphibious assault of the entire war. Admiral Raymond A. Spruance, commanding the 5th Fleet, knew from intelligence intercepts that the island's defenses would make Iwo Jima look like a training exercise. Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr. was handed command of the new 10th Army, a force of over 183,000 soldiers and Marines. Everyone, from the privates to the generals, understood that the commander of the Japanese 32nd Army, Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, would fight to the last man. 15/70ths. Ushijima was a master of attrition. Aided by his fanatical chief of staff, Lieutenant General Isamu Cho, he had turned the southern third of Okinawa into a fortress. His force of over 110,000 men, including thousands of Okinawan conscripts, had spent nearly a year constructing the Shuri defensive line. This wasn't a series of trenches. It was a subterranean kingdom of over 500 fortified caves and 40 kilometers of tunnels connecting hundreds of concrete pillboxes, each with interlocking fields of fire from their Type 92 heavy machine guns. Their strategy, developed after the fall of Saipan in July 1944, was simple: make the cost of victory so high that America would lose its will to fight. 16/70ths. Aboard the WWII Vf destroyer CV-9, in late March 1945, Major George C. Axtell and the other pilots of VMF 323 were briefed on Operation Iceberg. An engineer by training, Axtell studied the reconnaissance photos of the Shuri Line and felt a cold knot of dread form in his stomach. The 500-pound bombs they carried would do nothing but rearrange the dirt on top of the bunkers. The 5-inch HVARs couldn't possibly penetrate the layers of coral and concrete. He and his men, like Captain Jerry O'Connell, were being asked to provide close air support for the 77th Infantry Division under Major General Andrew D. Bruce and the 1st Marine Division under Major General Pedro del Valle, using tools they knew were inadequate for the job. The air in the briefing room was thick with tension and the smell of stale Pall Mall cigarettes, a world away from the clean Pacific air outside. 17/70ths. Meanwhile, the delivery system for Fieser's Secret was being mass-produced in total secrecy. The M69 incendiary bomb, developed by engineers at EA Laboratories in Brooklyn under contract W44009NG507, was a marvel of deadly design. It was a 6.2-pound hexagonal steel canister, 19.5 inches long, designed to act like a fiery syringe. It would be packed 38 at a time into an E-46 cluster bomb adapter. The factory workers assembling the casings were told they were making components for new types of portable fire extinguishers, a cover story that was never breached. 18/70ths. On March 30, 1945, just 48 hours before the invasion was to begin, the first top-secret shipment arrived in Saipan. It consisted of 50 tons of the powdered napalm Type C thickener in sealed drums labeled CWS Incendiary Thickener Compound 8A, and several thousand M69 bomb casings. Colonel Pickett flew from Washington to personally oversee the logistics, meeting with Admiral Nimitz's Ordnance Chief, Captain William S. Deke Parsons, in Guam. The protocol was established. The weapon would be held in reserve, its existence known only to a handful of senior officers, until General Buckner's army inevitably stalled against the main Shuri Line. The air on the tarmac was heavy and humid, thick with the smell of diesel and imminent conflict. 19/70ths. And so, on the eve of the bloodiest battle of the Pacific War, the pieces of the puzzle were scattered across the globe, deliberately kept separate by layers of classification. In his lab at Harvard, Dr. Louis Fieser had already moved on, having filed his final report for contract OEM-SR 175 on March 15, 1945, satisfied with the elegance of his chemical solution. On Okinawa, Lieutenant General Ushijima waited in his subterranean fortress, utterly confident in its ability to withstand any conventional American assault. And aboard the U.S. Essex, Major George C. Axtell performed his pre-flight checks on his F-4U-4 Corsair, completely unaware that a weapon born in a university basement, a weapon that would fundamentally change the nature of his job, was waiting for him in a guarded depot just over the horizon. 20/70ths. The work began in earnest on December 1, 1941, under the suffocating secrecy of contract OEM-SR 175. Dr. Vannevar Bush, the formidable director of the Office of Scientific Research and Development, and his deputy, Nobel laureate James B. Conant, had given Dr. Louis Fieser's group 5 inches a single, frustratingly vague directive: make a better fire. The existing M47 oil-based incendiaries were failing miserably in field tests conducted at the Aberdeen Proving Ground, burning out in less than 90 seconds and providing little tactical advantage. The pressure was immense. The Chemical Warfare Service needed a breakthrough, and they needed it yesterday. 21/70. Inside the X2 lab, the air was a constant miasma of acrid experimental fumes. Fieser, ever the meticulous academic in his stained white coat, and his lead research assistant, Dr. E.B. Hirschberg, a brilliant organic chemist who had earned his Ph.D. under Fieser in 1934, spent the first 6 months chasing dead ends. They tried to thicken gasoline with natural rubber dissolved in benzene, but the resulting gel was unstable, breaking down in temperatures above 80 degrees Fahrenheit. They experimented with isobutyl methacrylate polymers under Project Code X104A, spending over $50,000 of their initial $100,000 budget, only to produce a substance that was too viscous to be effectively weaponized. The low hum of the lab's ventilation system seemed to mock their failures, endlessly circulating the smell of burnt rubber and chemical defeat. 22/70. The breakthrough wasn't a single moment of genius, but a testament to Fieser's encyclopedic knowledge and relentless methodology. Frustrated with natural polymers by the spring of 1942, he pivoted his team's focus to an obscure area of chemistry: metallic soaps. He recalled a 1935 paper from German chemists at IG. Farben detailing the use of aluminum stearate to thicken lubricating oils. Fieser theorized that a similar compound could gel gasoline. He tasked a young postdoctoral fellow, Dr. Myron S. Simon, with systematically testing over 100 different aluminum soaps derived from various fatty acids. The lab filled with the rhythmic clatter of mechanical shakers and the whir of centrifuges as Simon worked 16-hour days. On May 10, 1942, Colonel M.R. Pickett made an unscheduled visit, his stern face and immaculate uniform a stark contrast to the lab's controlled chaos. He didn't need to say a word. His presence alone communicated the CWS's dwindling patience after 6 months of little progress. The weight of his stare was heavier than any official directive. 23/70. Then, on a sweltering Independence Day, July 4, 1942, they found it. In a simple 500 milliliter Pyrex beaker, Dr. Fieser himself carefully mixed a new powdered agent, a co-precipitated aluminum soap of *pH-thinic and *palm ITIC acids, into a canister of standard issue 87-octane gasoline. The result was instantaneous and startling. The liquid transformed into a sticky, cohesive brownish gel with a specific gravity of 0.906. He inverted the beaker. It didn't run. The acrid, solvent-like smell was overwhelming. He had created napalm. 24/70. The first field test was arranged with utmost secrecy. On July 15, 1942, Dr. Fieser and a stone-faced Colonel Pickett drove out to a small, isolated section of the Jefferson Proving Ground in Indiana, designated Test Area C. 2 CWS technicians, Sergeant John Riley and Corporal Evan Davis, carefully placed a 5-gallon bucket of the freshly mixed napalm Type C gel at the center of a concrete pad. From an observation bunker 100 yards away, Pickett gave a curt nod. The technicians ignited it with a thermite charge. The result was breathtakingly horrific. The gel erupted into a churning fireball that roared with a deafening low-frequency hum, reaching a temperature of over 100 degrees Fahrenheit and burning for a full 8 minutes and 12 seconds. Splatters of the burning jelly clung to a vertical wooden test wall, continuing to burn, a feat no previous incendiary could manage. Pickett, his face illuminated by the hellish glow, allowed himself the faintest of smiles. 25/70. The successful test immediately shifted the project from research to weaponization, and security tightened to an almost paranoid degree. Colonel Pickett, operating under the direct authority of General Brehan B. Somervell of the Army Service Forces, initiated Contract W44009NG507, with a small, unassuming company called EA Laboratories in Brooklyn, New York. Their task: design and mass-produce a hexagonal steel canister, 19.5 inches long, that could effectively deliver the gel. Back at Harvard, Fieser's team of 12 chemists, including Dr. Hirschberg and Dr. Simon, were brought into a windowless room one by one on August 1, 1942. There, two grim-faced FBI agents, Special Agent Robert Hendon and Special Agent Samuel McKee, had them sign national security oaths, binding them to absolute silence under the Espionage Act of 1917, warning them that a single leaked word meant a minimum of 20 years in Leavenworth. The powdered thickener was officially designated CWS Incendiary Thickener Compound 8A, a deliberately bland name designed to be lost in the endless bureaucracy of wartime logistics. 26/70ths. By late 1943, the production of Compound 8A had become a major clandestine operation. Major General William N. Porter, Chief of the Chemical Warfare Service, personally oversaw the secret retooling of two major chemical plants, the Nuadex Products Company in Elizabeth, New Jersey, and the Faro Dobe Corporation in Nashville, Tennessee. Under the guise of manufacturing a new type of waterproof adhesive for Navy landing craft, these factories began churning out the fine, white powder at a combined rate of over 500 tons per month. The deception was flawless. Not a single worker ever suspected they were producing the key ingredient for the war's most terrifying new weapon. 27/70ths. Simultaneously, the delivery system was being perfected. The M69 incendiary bomb was a marvel of deadly engineering, a product of the sharp mind of Arthur B. Klein at EA Laboratories. His team designed the 6.2-pound hexagonal canister to be more than just a container. Inside, it held 2.6 pounds of napalm gel. Upon impact, a 3-second delay fuse would trigger a small black powder expulsion charge and a white phosphorus igniter. This created a high-pressure jet, a squirt gun of fire, that could propel the burning, sticky gel over 100 feet. These capabilities were rigorously tested throughout 1944 at WWII Proving Ground in Utah, where technicians listened to the distinct thump-whoosh of the M69's bursting, a sound that would soon become synonymous with total annihilation in the Pacific. 28/70ths. The immense secrecy took a profound personal toll on the men at the top. Dr. Louis Fieser, who meticulously documented his life in a personal diary, never once wrote the words napalm or ProjectXRay. His entries from 1942 to 1945 speak of university politics, his research on steroids, and his wife, Mary Peters Fieser, herself a renowned chemist who was never cleared to know the true nature of the work happening in her husband's basement lab, just 200 feet from their home. Colonel M.R. Pickett, a devout Presbyterian with a wife and 2 young sons in Virginia, became withdrawn and developed a nervous habit of constantly checking his watch. He carried the operational details of a weapon of mass destruction in his head, a burden he shared with no one, a ghost living inside the rigid confines of his immaculate U.S. Army uniform. The project was so compartmentalized that by 1944, fewer than 50 men in the entire Allied war effort knew the full story from the Harvard lab to the Brooklyn factory. 29/70ths. The final go-ahead came on January 15, 1945. After reviewing the final WWII Proving Ground test data, specifically report DPGTR 44112, which confirmed a 97% ignition reliability rate, General Henry Hap Arnold, commander of the U.S. Army Air Forces, gave his secret approval. He and General Leslie Groves of the Manhattan Project were among the very few who understood the strategic implications of America's 2 new secret weapons. Under top-secret orders from Admiral Chester Nimitz, CINCPAC, the first 50-ton shipment of Compound 8A was loaded onto the U.S. Saginaw Bay CVE-82, its true nature hidden on the manifest as adhesive-based compound. The secret was finally going to war. 30/70ths. In the subterranean command bunker beneath Shuri Castle, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and stale tea, Colonel Hiromichi Yahara, the brilliant and pragmatic senior operations officer for the 32nd Army, stared at the reports from April 12, 1945. They made no sense. A Type 96,150 mm howitzer emplacement on Kakazu Ridge, position K4, had gone silent. A runner, Private Kenji Ito, described a U.S. plane dropping something that wasn't a bomb, but a rain of fire that clung to the concrete. The smell, he insisted, wasn't the sharp, familiar scent of phosphorus, but something oily and sickeningly chemical. Yahara dismissed it as the ravings of a terrified boy. 31/70. Aboard the U.S. Essex, on April 15, 1945, Major George C. Axtell received his first briefing on the new ordnance. His commanding officer, Colonel William A. Wild Bill Millington, of Marine Aircraft Group 31, was uncharacteristically vague. He called them M69 firebombs and told Axtell's squadron to drop the E-46 cluster adapters from no lower than 2,000 feet to ensure proper dispersal. Axtell, with his Berkeley engineering degree, was skeptical. The E-46 clusters felt too light under the wings of his F-4U-4 Corsair, which had a standard payload capacity of over 2,000 pounds. Chewing on his unlit cigar stub, he felt the smooth, cold aluminum of the new casing, a strange and unfamiliar weight that promised something unknown. He and his wingman, Lieutenant Hank Miller, were simply told to aim for the ventilation slits of the bunkers. 32/70. The first large-scale test came on April 27, 1945, against a heavily fortified position on Hacksaw Ridge. Major Axtell led a flight of 8 Corsairs. Diving at 250 knots, he released his payload at exactly 2,000 feet. He watched in his rear-view mirror as the E-46 cluster burst open, scattering 38 of the M69 canisters like metallic seeds. Moments later, the ridge erupted not in a single explosion, but in a series of interconnected blossoms of churning, orange fire. Deep inside the targeted bunker, Radioman Sergeant Kenji Tanaka of the 62nd Division screamed a panicked, incoherent message into his Type 94 radio set about a crawling fire rain that was eating the air before the transmission cut to static. Back in Tokyo, analysts under Field Marshal Hajime Sugiyama received the garbled intercept but dismissed it as another exaggerated report of standard American M47 phosphorus bombs, a fatal miscalculation. 33/70. Colonel Yahara was incandescent with rage. A reinforced concrete pillbox on Sugarloaf Hill, position SL-12, had been neutralized on May 4, 1945, without a single crack in its 4-foot-thick walls. His chief combat engineer, Captain Kenjiro Takeda, reported that the Type 92 heavy machine gun inside had been melted into a slag of unrecognizable steel. The bodies of the 8-man crew were fused to the walls. There was no crater, no shrapnel, just an intense, all-consuming heat that had somehow poured through the 6-inch firing slit. The mystery was infuriating, and it was costing him his best men. 34/70. The secret was kept just as tightly on the American side. On the hangar deck of the U.S. Essex, the ordnance team, led by Chief Petty Officer Frank Kowalski, mixed the weapon in relative ignorance. Following the instructions on a laminated card labeled Recipe CWS-8A4, his men would pour the fine white powder from unmarked 50-pound sacks into 55-gallon drums of gasoline using a portable air-powered mixer. The air filled with a sickly sweet chemical odor that clung to their clothes. They were told the powder was a new fuel degulling agent to prevent lines from freezing at high altitude. Kowalski, a father of 3 from Chicago's South Side who just wanted to get home, saw no reason to question the official story from Lieutenant Commander John Davis, the ship's ordnance officer. 35/70. The Japanese intelligence failure was catastrophic and complete. Major Isamu Komori, chief of the 32nd Army's G2 intelligence section, dutifully collected pilot reports and survivor testimonies. The Americans themselves were calling it fire jelly or hell gas over their radios, lacking any framework for organometallic chemistry. Komori's official report to Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, dated May 8, 1945, concluded that the Americans were using a new, highly effective, but fundamentally conventional incendiary based on thermite or magnesium. His recommendation was to reinforce bunker interiors with asbestos sheeting and add extra layers of sandbags to observation slits. Defenses that were utterly useless against a liquid fire that flowed like water, stuck like glue, and consumed every last molecule of oxygen in a sealed space. This single, flawed intelligence assessment, born of total ignorance, directly led to the deaths of thousands of Japanese soldiers. 36/70. After a mission against Shuri's outer defenses, on May 11, 1945, Major Axtell was visibly shaken. He described to Colonel Millington how he saw the fire from his M69s pour into a cave entrance. Seconds later, thick, oily black smoke began gushing from a separate fissure in the rock, over 150 feet away. It hadn't exploded. It had flowed through the earth like a predator. Millington, a veteran of Guadalcanal, simply put a hand on his shoulder. "Don't think about it, George," he said, his voice low. "Just know that it works." 37/70. The tactical reality of the weapon was consistently lost in the fog of war and disbelief. On May 14, 1945, a forward observer for the 24th Division, Corporal Hideo Sato, watched a napalm strike obliterate a mortar pit on Conical Hill. He grabbed his Type 94 field radio, his voice cracking with terror, as he tried to describe the sticky fire from hell that melts the very rock. His company commander, Captain Jiro Nomura, listening from 500 yards away, made a battlefield diagnosis. He told his radio man to log the report as Observer Sato experiencing severe combat fatigue. The truth was simply too insane to be believed. 38/70. But the numbers didn't lie. Between April 20th and May 20th, 1945, Marine Aircraft Group 31 and Navy squadrons from Task Force 58 flew over 210 dedicated sorties against the Shuri Line, delivering an estimated 45,000 gallons of napalm. A secret after-action report filed by Major General Pedro del Valle, commander of the 1st Marine Division, for 10th Army HQ, stated that infantry casualty rates in assaults immediately following these special incendiary preparations had dropped by a staggering 42%. Meanwhile, General Ushijima and his fanatical Chief of Staff, Lieutenant General Isamu Cho, couldn't reconcile their own reports. They saw minimal structural damage to their fortifications, but catastrophic, inexplicable losses in personnel. They had no strategic category for a weapon that could kill every soldier inside a bunker without even scratching the concrete. 39/70. The psychological impact was just as devastating. On May 22, 1945, Marines from the 77th Infantry Division recovered the diary of a deceased Japanese officer, Major Kenji Abe. A Nisei translator, Sergeant Frank Hoshida, read the frantic final entry, which described the new American weapon with superstitious dread. "It is not a bomb," Abe had written. "It is the dragon's breath that hunts men in the darkness of the earth." The diary was rushed to the G2 section of 10th Army Command, where intelligence officers like Captain Samuel Harris realized they had a weapon that was destroying the enemy's morale as effectively as it destroyed their bodies. 40/70. The secrecy was a chain of deliberate ignorance that stretched across the globe. Back in his lab at Harvard, Dr. Louis Fieser received only the most cryptic updates. A telex from Colonel Pickett arrived on May 18, 1945. Its text, cold and clinical. "ProjectXRay performance in adverse operational conditions exceeds specification OEMSR 175. Full production run authorized by CWS-DC." Fieser, a man who saw the world in molecular bonds, felt a quiet, detached satisfaction. His elegant chemical solution had worked. He had no name for the island, no images of the fire, only confirmation that his formula was stable and effective. 41/70. The ultimate proof of the enemy's confusion came from the sky. During a massed kamikaze attack on May 25, 1945, a Japanese pilot, Lieutenant Saburo Tanaka of the 6th Air Army, banked his Zero to avoid U.S. anti-aircraft fire. He witnessed a flight of Corsairs making a run on Shuri Castle and saw the E-46 clusters open. In his final, poetic radio transmission back to his base on Formosa, he described the sight of a strange metal flower blooming in the sky, releasing small silver fish that bring fire. He was shot down by the USS Essex S-guns seconds later. This garbled, almost beautiful description was the closest Japanese intelligence ever came to understanding the M69's delivery system, and it told them absolutely nothing of value. 42/70. By May 29, 1945, the Shuri Line had completely collapsed. In Colonel Yahara's abandoned command bunker, U.S. Marines found his final, hastily written assessment of the battle. He attributed the 32nd Army's defeat to two factors: overwhelming American numbers and a new, savagely effective liquid fire weapon of unknown composition that makes subterranean defense untenable. This captured document was the first hard evidence that the enemy high command knew they had been defeated by a mystery they never came close to solving. 43/70. Even the men who delivered the fire were kept in the dark. Major George C. Axtell flew 112 combat missions over Okinawa and was awarded the Navy Cross for his heroism. He never heard the word napalm until years after the war. For him and the other pilots of VMF 323, it was simply the new stuff, or, as a gallows humor joke, Fieser's jelly, a whispered rumor about some professor back in the States. They knew its 2,000-foot burst altitude and its horrifying results, but its name, its chemistry, and its origin remained a top secret, a deliberate fog of ignorance enforced by Colonel Pickett to protect the war's most effective new conventional weapon. 44/70. The secret of Project X-Ray remained intact because it was so fundamentally alien to the Japanese military mindset. Leaders like General Ushijima and Colonel Yahara were masters of a warfare based on engineering, ballistics, and the Bushido Code. They understood explosives, steel, and honorable death. They had no conceptual framework for a weapon born in an organic chemistry lab, a sticky gel that rendered their brilliant defensive network obsolete. They were searching for a bigger bomb, a better explosive, while the real weapon was a chemical formula, an idea that flowed past their fortifications and consumed their soldiers, leaving them defeated, demoralized, and utterly mystified to the very end. 45/70. The fall of the Shuri Line on May 29, 1945, transformed Project X-Ray from a desperate experiment into a core tactical doctrine. General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr., in a top-secret dispatch to CINCPAC on June 1, 1945, officially requested a 200% increase in CWS incendiary thickener compound 8A shipments. The numbers from Major General Pedro del Valle's 1st Marine Division were undeniable. In assaults following napalm strikes, American casualty rates had plummeted by over 40%, saving an estimated 300-500 lives in just 3 weeks of intensified operations. The weapon was no longer a secret curiosity. It was a war-winning necessity. 46/70. This new demand sent a shockwave through the clandestine supply chain overseen by Colonel M.R. Pickett. From his temporary office on Guam, which perpetually smelled of diesel fumes and damp canvas, Pickett coordinated with the 801st Chemical Company on Tinian to triple their mixing output. Production of the powdered compound 8A at the Nudex Products Company in New Jersey and the Faro Doby Corporation in Nashville was pushed to a combined 750 tons per month. On the airfields, the CWS ordnance teams under men like Chief Petty Officer Frank Kowalski worked grueling 18-hour shifts, the sickly sweet chemical odor of gelled gasoline becoming the grim, ever-present scent of their new reality. They mixed over 10,000 gallons a day, their arms aching from wrestling the 55-gallon drums, still believing they were handling nothing more than a new type of fuel degelling agent for high-altitude bombers. 47/70ths. The evolution of tactics was rapid and brutal. By early June 1945, what had been targeted strikes became systematic obliteration. For the final assault on the Jeju Dake Escarpment, Major George C. Axtell and the pilots of VMF 323 no longer aimed for individual bunkers. Their new orders, issued by Colonel William A. Wild Bill Millington on June 8, were to create a wall of fire 500 yards ahead of the advancing 7th Infantry Division. Flying in staggered formations of 12 F-4U-4 Corsairs, they would release their E-46 clusters in a sequence designed to saturate a 1,000-foot-wide area. The ground below would vanish under a rolling liquid inferno that burned for a full 10 minutes at 200 degrees Fahrenheit, consuming everything. From his cockpit at 5,000 feet, Axtell could feel the heat radiating upwards, a physical wave of man-made hell. The roar of his two 100-horsepower Pratt & Whitney engine was drowned out by the low, hungry hum of the firestorm he had just unleashed. This tactic, perfected in the last 14 days of the battle, became the blueprint for close air support for the next 30 years. 48/70ths. As the weapon's use became more widespread, Colonel Pickett's security protocols became almost draconian. On June 10, 1945, he issued CWS Directive 45-11B, classifying the M69's mixing formula as a restricted process, known only to commissioned ordnance officers like Lieutenant Commander John Davis. Enlisted men were now forbidden from handling the powdered compound 8A directly. The cover story was reinforced with fake shipping manifests for waterproofing adhesive, a deception personally managed by Captain Samuel Harris of 10th Army G2. The fear was palpable. If a single pilot was captured and revealed even the operational details, the 2,000-foot burst altitude of the E-46 cluster, it might give the Japanese a clue. 49/70ths. The enemy, meanwhile, remained trapped in a state of terrified ignorance. On June 12, 1945, a Japanese engineering team under Captain Kenjiro Takeda managed to retrieve a partially melted fragment of an M69 casing from a bunker on Kunishi Ridge. Major Isamu Komori's intelligence section analyzed it for 48 straight hours. The metallurgical report was a dead end. It was simple, SAE 1010 low-carbon steel. The chemical residue was misidentified as a complex zinc-phosphorus compound. This flawed analysis was cabled to Field Marshal Hajime Sugiyama's headquarters in Tokyo, reinforcing their belief that they faced a conventional, albeit powerful, incendiary. Their recommended countermeasure, dousing fortifications with water before an attack, was tragically, laughably ineffective against a gasoline-based gel that simply floated on water and continued to burn. 50/70ths. The impact was now being measured in saved lives and time. A secret study for General Buckner's staff, designated USM CCWS AAROKI 45-7B and completed on June 15, 1945, compiled the definitive data. The report, hand-carried by Colonel Pickett to Admiral Chester Nimitz in Guam, concluded that the concentrated use of napalm had directly saved an estimated 8,000 American lives. More critically, it had accelerated the capture of the southern defensive lines by at least 14 days, a crucial time-saving measure as Typhoon Viper was forecast to hit the island by the end of the month. 51/70ths. But the secret wasn't static. It was already evolving. Back in the quiet, sterile confines of the X2 lab at Harvard, the war felt a million miles away. Yet Dr. Louis Fieser, was already working to make it more terrible. Under a new contract, OEMSR 552, he and his lead assistant, Dr. E.B. Hirschberg, were perfecting a second-generation incendiary. Instead of metallic soap, this new formula used polystyrene and benzene to gel the gasoline. The result, which Fieser privately noted in his logbook on June 16, 1945, was a far more stable compound he called Napalm B. It was less expensive to produce, its burn time was extended to nearly 15 minutes, and its adhesive properties were even more pronounced. The low hum of the lab's fume hoods was the only sound as Fieser meticulously measured the new gel's viscosity, a man of pure science already designing the fire for the next war, completely detached from the one his first invention was currently winning. 52/70. This evolving secret was already reshaping the future. At CINCPAC headquarters in Guam, strategic planners under Admiral Raymond A. Spruance were wargaming Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of the Japanese home islands. The results of Wargame Scenario D4, run on June 19, 1945, were stunning. By incorporating, quote, special incendiary preparations on the scale of 500,000 gallons against the coastal defenses of Kyushu, the models predicted a 30% reduction in American casualties in the first 72 hours of the invasion. The secret born in Fieser's lab wasn't just a bunker buster anymore. It was now a cornerstone of America's entire end-of-war strategy, a decisive advantage that promised to save tens of thousands of lives in the final, bloodiest act. 53/70. The weapon's momentum had become unstoppable. When Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr. was tragically killed by artillery fire on June 18, 1945, command of the 10th Army passed seamlessly to Marine General Roy Geiger. One of his first actions was to confirm that all scheduled napalm sorties for the next 72 hours would proceed without change. In less than 2 months, the M69 had become so integral to U.S. ground operations that its use was no longer a decision, but an assumption. 54/70. When the battle for Okinawa officially ended on June 22, 1945, the legacy of ProjectXRay was written in ash. Over 110,000 Japanese defenders had been killed, thousands of them incinerated by a weapon they never identified. In his post-capture interrogation on June 25, Colonel Hiromichi Yahara, the 32nd Army's brilliant senior staff officer, spoke to his American interrogator, Captain Samuel Harris, in a voice devoid of emotion. He stated that the, quote, unnatural liquid fire was the single greatest factor in the psychological collapse of his veteran troops. The secret hadn't just melted their guns and consumed their air, it had dissolved their will to fight from the inside out, a victory of chemistry as much as courage. 55/70. June 15, 1972, 11:42 a.m., National Archives and Records Administration, College Park, Maryland. In the sterile silence of Reading Room 3, broken only by the low hum of fluorescent lights, a secret that had slept for 27 years began to stir. Dr. Evelyn Reed, a military historian with a reputation for relentless digging, carefully lifted the brittle cardboard lid. The box, labeled *NARA Record Group 227, OSRD, Entry 88, smelled of dust and decaying acid-free paper. Her hands, steady despite the tremor of anticipation, reached inside for the file codenamed ProjectXRay, a document she felt held the key to an untold story of the Pacific War. 56/70. Dr. Reed, a sharp, determined woman of 34 with a Ph.D. in military history from Johns Hopkins, had spent 2 years fighting for access. She had a habit of pushing her horn-rimmed glasses up her nose when concentrating, a gesture she made now as she examined the file. The documents had only been declassified 72 hours prior, under Department of Defense Directive 72-14B, a sweeping order that released millions of pages of OSRD records. She'd stumbled upon a footnote in a heavily redacted 1951 CWS report mentioning, quote, ProjectXRay, and had filed a Freedom of Information Act request every 6 months for the last 24 months. Now, surrounded by the quiet rustle of turning pages from other researchers, she was the first person outside a tiny, cleared circle to see the truth in over a quarter century. 57/70. Her breath caught in her throat. Tucked inside a folder marked CWS POC Liaison was a carbon copy of a memorandum dated April 18, 1945. It was from Colonel M.R. Pickett to the Ordnance Chief of the 10th Army. The key line leaped off the page, a formal request for the expedited aerial delivery of 5,000 units of incendiary gel Type C for the neutralization of subterranean enemy fortifications. This was it, the smoking gun. It wasn't a general weapon. It was a specific, chemical prescription for the tactical nightmare of Okinawa, linking Pickett and Fieser's lab directly to General Buckner's stalled army. 58/70. For the next 72 hours, fueled by stale coffee from the archive's vending machine, Dr. Reed didn't go home. She worked in a feverish trance, the rhythmic whir and click of the microfilm reader her only companion. She pulled the recently declassified after-action reports from Marine Aircraft Group 31 and the pilot logs of Major George C. Axtell, cross-referencing sortie dates with Pickett's supply manifests. The numbers lined up perfectly. She found Fieser's final report from July 1945, which detailed napalm Type C's chemical properties, a burn time of over 10 minutes at 200 degrees Fahrenheit, and a viscosity of 250 centipoise. It matched precisely with the descriptions in 10th Army battlefield reports of a uniquely adherent liquid fire. She placed a late-night call to her mentor, the famed historian Drive, Stephen Ambrose, at the University of New Orleans, who listened in stunned silence for 15 minutes before simply saying, "My God, Evelyn, you've rewritten the entire battle." 59/70. Her findings, published in a bombshell article in the fall 1973 issue of the * Journal of Military History, sent a seismic shock through the academic world. Historians like Dr. Gerhard Weinberg, a leading scholar on World War II, had long attributed the collapse of the Shuri Line to the overwhelming force of American artillery and the sheer heroism of the 1st Marine Division. Reed's meticulously documented evidence forced a painful but necessary reevaluation. The victory at Okinawa wasn't just a story of brute force, it was a story of secret science. The narrative shifted irrevocably, acknowledging that a weapon born in a Harvard chemistry lab, deployed with surgical precision, was a decisive factor that had been completely hidden from the historical record for 27 years. 60/70. The revelation reached the men who had been there. In 1974, a * Chicago Tribune journalist tracked down George C. Axtell, then a 54-year-old civil engineer living a quiet life in Pasadena. He was shown a copy of Dr. Reed's article, including the chemical formula for napalm. The decorated war hero, a man who had flown 112 combat missions, stared at the page for a full minute, the sounds of his suburban street fading away. "We just called it fire jelly," he said, his voice raspy. "We didn't know what it was. We just knew it saved our boys on the ground." 61/70. The declassified ProjectXRay files also contained the final, damning piece of the puzzle, the proof of the enemy's complete and total ignorance. Tucked within Entry 88 were the translated intelligence reports from Major Isamu Komori's G2 section of the 32nd Army. His official assessment from May 8, 1945, misidentified the residue as a, quote, complex zinc-phosphorus compound, a fatal analytical error. Also included were the full interrogation transcripts of Colonel Hiromichi Yahara, conducted by Captain Samuel Harris on June 25, 1945. Yahara described the weapon as an unnatural, crawling fire, and admitted his engineers never once came close to understanding its composition or devising a countermeasure. The secret had been protected not just by classification, but by its own radical, chemical novelty, a concept so alien to Japanese military science that it remained an unsolvable, terrifying mystery to the very end. 62/70. Dr. Reed's research unearthed an even more chilling continuity. A final addendum to the ProjectXRay file, dated June 19, 1945, detailed Dr. Louis Fieser's work under a new contract, OEMSR 552. It was the formula for a more stable, second-generation incendiary that used polystyrene to gel the gasoline, Napalm B. This was the very same chemical compound that would be loaded into the M47 bombs dropped by US F-4 Phantoms over Korea and Vietnam. The documents provided the undeniable thread, the institutional lineage connecting the top-secret bunker buster of Okinawa to the horrific, televised images that defined a new generation of warfare 25 years later. The secret of 1945 hadn't just ended a battle, it had begun a legacy. 63/70. On October 11, 1975, in a small, quiet ceremony at the Pentagon, the truth received its official, belated acknowledgement. Dr. Louis Fieser, who had passed away in July 1972, just 1 month after Dr. Reed's discovery, was posthumously awarded the Distinguished Civilian Service Award. His wife, the renowned chemist Mary Peters Fieser, accepted the medal. Colonel M.R. Pickett, then 75 and living in quiet retirement in Virginia, attended the ceremony. He stood ramrod straight, a ghost from a secret war, and refused all comment, a silent guardian of the project to the very end. 64/70. By the early 1980s, the official histories had all been rewritten. Dr. Evelyn Reed's 1976 Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Fire of Reason, ProjectXRay and the Chemical War, became the definitive text on the subject. The story of Okinawa was no longer simply one of courage versus fanaticism, of General Buckner's army against General Ushijima's fortress. It was now and forever also the story of a quiet, meticulous chemist named Dr. Louis Fieser and a stern, duty-bound officer named Colonel M.R. Pickett. Together, from a Cambridge basement and a Washington office, they had unleashed a secret fire that saved thousands of American lives, ended a battle, and reshaped the very nature of modern warfare for decades to come. 65/70. The legacy of Project X-Ray is a complex and haunting one, written in declassified ink and indelible ash. For the men on the ground, like the Marines of the 1st Division under Major General Pedro del Valle, it was a miracle weapon, a divine intervention that silenced guns that had been slaughtering their friends for weeks. It saved an estimated 8,000 American lives, a number that represents sons, fathers, and husbands who came home because of a secret they never knew existed. For them, the sickly sweet smell of the gel was the scent of survival. 66/70. For the Japanese defenders inside the Shuri Line, it was a chemical demon, a foe beyond comprehension. The soldiers under Colonel Hiromichi Yahara were prepared to die for their emperor, but they were prepared for bullets and shrapnel, not for a sticky liquid fire that flowed through their fortifications, consumed all the oxygen, and melted steel. The weapon didn't just kill them, it invalidated their entire strategy, their courage, and their sacrifice, turning their subterranean fortresses into inescapable crematoriums. It was a death so terrifying it broke the famed Japanese fighting spirit. 67/70. For the men who created it, the legacy was one of profound and perhaps deliberate detachment. Dr. Louis Fieser returned to his life of academia at Harvard, publishing over 300 scientific papers and 7 books, mostly on organic chemistry and steroids, after 1945. He rarely, if ever, spoke of his wartime work. He was a scientist who had been given a problem, make gasoline sticky, and he had solved it with elegant, lethal efficiency. Colonel M.R. Pickett retired from the Army in 1952, a man who had held one of the war's biggest secrets and carried the weight of it in silence for the rest of his life, his duty fulfilled. 68/70. The technology itself, of course, did not remain a secret. The principles developed by Fieser and his team in the X2 lab under contract OEM-SR 175 became the foundation for all modern incendiary weapons. The secret of Okinawa became the standard operating procedure in Korea and Vietnam, its horrifying effectiveness rebroadcast in color on the evening news. The M69 bomb and the E46 cluster adapter were the direct ancestors of the weapons that would create some of the most controversial and iconic images of the 20th century. The fire born in secret to end one war's deadliest battle would go on to define the moral complexities of the next two. 69/70. In the end, the story comes back to that dusty box in the National Archives. After her book was published, Dr. Evelyn Reed returned to the files one last time. Deep within Colonel Pickett's personal effects, filed under a miscellaneous tab, she found a single, folded photograph. It was a grainy aerial reconnaissance photo of Hacksaw Ridge, dated April 27, 1945. On the back, in Pickett's precise military handwriting, were just 4 words. ProjectXRay. It works. He hadn't written it with triumph, but with the stark, final, and heavy finality of a man closing a ledger. A secret kept, a battle turned, and a world forever changed by the terrible, brilliant fire of reason. 70/70. The legacy of ProjectXRay is a complex and haunting one, written in declassified ink and indelible ash. For the men on the ground, like the Marines of the 1st Division under Major General Pedro del Valle, it was a miracle weapon, a divine intervention that silenced guns that had been slaughtering their friends for weeks. It saved an estimated 8,000 American lives, a number that represents sons, fathers, and husbands who came home because of a secret they never knew existed. For them, the sickly sweet smell of the gel was the scent of survival. 66/70. For the Japanese defenders inside the Shuri Line, it was a chemical demon, a foe beyond comprehension. The soldiers under Colonel Hiromichi Yahara were prepared to die for their emperor, but they were prepared for bullets and shrapnel, not for a sticky liquid fire that flowed through their fortifications, consumed all the oxygen, and melted steel. The weapon didn't just kill them. It invalidated their entire strategy, their courage, and their sacrifice, turning their subterranean fortresses into inescapable crematoriums. It was a death so terrifying, it broke the famed Japanese fighting spirit. 67/70. For the men who created it, the legacy was one of profound and perhaps deliberate detachment. Dr. Louis Fieser returned to his life of academia at Harvard, publishing over 300 scientific papers and 7 books, mostly on organic chemistry and steroids, after 1945. He rarely, if ever, spoke of his wartime work. He was a scientist who had been given a problem, make gasoline sticky, and he had solved it with elegant, lethal efficiency. Colonel M.R. Pickett retired from the Army in 1952, a man who had held one of the war's biggest secrets and carried the weight of it in silence for the rest of his life, his duty fulfilled. 68/70. The technology itself, of course, did not remain a secret. The principles developed by Fieser and his team in the X2 lab under contract, OEM-SR 175, became the foundation for all modern incendiary weapons. The secret of Okinawa became the standard operating procedure in Korea and Vietnam, its horrifying effectiveness rebroadcast in color on the evening news. The M69 bomb and the E46 cluster adapter were the direct ancestors of the weapons that would create some of the most controversial and iconic images of the 20th century. The fire, born in secret to end one war's deadliest battle, would go on to define the moral complexities of the next two. 69/70. In the end, the story comes back to that dusty box in the National Archives. After her book was published, Dr. Evelyn Reed returned to the files one last time. Deep within Colonel Pickett's personal effects, filed under a miscellaneous tab, she found a single, folded photograph. It was a grainy aerial reconnaissance photo of Hacksaw Ridge, dated April 27, 1945. On the back, in Pickett's precise military handwriting, were just 4 words: ProjectXRay. It works. He hadn't written it with triumph, but with the stark, final, and heavy finality of a man closing a ledger. A secret kept, a battle turned, and a world forever changed by the terrible, brilliant fire of reason.